Alright. Segment. We are going to be talking about why games are delayed. Why do developers delay games? So this is going to be based off my own experience as a producer in the game industry now almost 5 years since I graduated from university. And basically my experience mostly in like AAA, AA-ish scale games, why games get delayed. Disclaimer, there are also other reasons why games can get delayed. This is not an exhaustive list of reasons why games get delayed. These are just some of the reasons that I have experienced and that I've seen in the industry of why games get delayed. So let's get to it, shall we? Let's talk about games and why they are delayed. Okay, so when we talk about games and game development in general, one thing that we have to... a phrase that gets thrown a lot within developers is scope. And no, I'm not talking about your 360 no scope kind of scope. I'm talking about like the size of a game. Yeah, so when we say scope in game development, we mean what are the features in a game? Like, does it have upgrades, an upgrade tree? Does it have a leveling system? Does it have grappling hook? Jetpack, driving, flying, like what are all the things that the game has and how defined are each of those things? So let's say you have flying in a game, but you can only fly airplanes, not helicopters. For example, that could be like a limitation of that specific feature. So you have to know all the different parts that you want to put in the game and then roughly how large each feature is. And this will vary a lot during the development of the game. Usually the scope starts way too big and then you have to start cutting at the scope and make it smaller to fit your budget and schedule, which can change as we know. It can also be like how many levels are there in a game, or how many worlds are there in a game. If, let's say it's a platformer with different worlds, how many worlds are there? How many levels are there in one world? How many weapons are there in a game, how many characters, how many skins, etc., etc. So this is scope when we talk about games. So now you know what that term means, because it's important to understand this term, because we talk about it a lot in game development. And defining scope is really difficult, because when you're defining your scope at the beginning of the game project, you know very little about the concretes of the game. You have the ideas, unless it's a sequel, of course. Then it's a different case, because when it's a sequel, you're already building on a pre-existing core, which makes it easier. But if you are making something new, or something new in that franchise, then it's more challenging. But yeah, in the beginning, you have vague ideas before you have actually implemented them, and the closer you get to your release, the more you start to understand what you can and can't achieve. Now then, getting on to game delays. So we have to also consider that there are delays that are seen by the player. Stuff like, Cyberpunk, the CD Projekt Red, that was recently just delayed by 2 months. And then before that, it was delayed by, what was it? 6 months or something? But anyway, those are player-facing delays. So, a game has an announced release date, then the company realizes, shit, we need more time because of reasons which I'm going to go into in a second. And then they tell the public, hey, we are actually going to change the release date. But there are also delays that are invisible. So you might have a game in development, it might be announced, it might not be announced, but there is no release date announced for it yet. And then that release date can get changed multiple times, but without anyone actually knowing about it, because the release date hasn't been announced to the public. The developers and publishers can change the release date more easily because there are less expectations around that. So we have to take this into consideration. There are visible and invisible delays. So, let's talk about situations that lead to a game being delayed. So, the scope that we talked about earlier. So, one reason that a game can get delayed is because the scope is increased. So, you might be, it depends which part of development you're in. So, just very briefly, development usually goes in these stages. You have concepting phase, where you kind of think about the idea of the game. Then you have pre-production, where you try to flesh out the idea and how everything will be implemented. And then you have production, where you make the full game, and then you release the game. Very, very briefly, it's more complicated than that. I hope I will get that video done at some point where I explain this in more detail. But yeah, so it depends when this increase in scope happens. The earlier it happens, the cheaper it becomes in theory, because it's easier to make changes the earlier you are on in a project. But this increase in scope is usually a combination of business and creative reasons. So you might, during pre-production, notice that the game really needs this X feature. Let's say it's a 3D platformer, because I like 3D platformers, and in pre-production you notice that something's missing, that it's fun to play alone, but it would be really fun if this game had online multiplayer. Adding online multiplayer to a game is really difficult. It's not just like press the add online to the game button. It's really complex, especially if you're using an engine that is not used to that kind of thing. It takes a lot of time. So this could be an increase in scope, which causes the schedule to be prolonged, for example. And this is a creative reason because the game is more fun, and it's a business reason because the game becomes more appealing for players to buy. So it can be an increase because it makes the game better and it becomes more appealing for people to buy. This could be one reason. Another reason is that you're working on the game, but creatively it's not quite coming together. You might be in pre-production, you might be in production even, and you're noticing it's not quite clicking. You're doing play tests, you're doing user tests with Research Lab, and the feedback you're getting from your user tests is that some areas of the game are really not clicking. Some core parts of the game that are really important for the success of the game, both creatively and financially, are not clicking with the player. The game is not achieving its vision. So you need to have some extra time to get it to a better place. So if this happens in conception and pre-production, it's cheaper because you have a smaller team at those parts, and during those times making changes is still easier. In production it becomes a lot more difficult because you are a lot further along, and making changes requires making changes to a lot more of the game. But this can be one reason. I think, if I recall correctly, BioShock famously had was it half a year added to its pre-production cycle, which made it a lot better as a game. So this can be one of those situations. I don't know the story behind that. I've just heard this story. Then, too many big bugs is one reason. So you're getting close to your launch, because usually if you have a AAA game that gets released as a boxed copy, so a physical disc, that game needs to be ready 3 months before you launch the game, because it has to be sent to printing. The discs need to be printed, and that takes 3 months. I think it's 4 months on the Switch, if I recall. But yeah, you usually have to have the game ready 3 months before launch, and then you can push stuff into the day one patch during that 3-month period that you can't work on the game anymore. So you have to have the game ready already fairly early on. So if you start noticing a few months before your deadline for the game to be ready that, hey, there's a lot of stuff broken in this game, or you have to push back so you can polish to make sure the game is not as buggy, then you can push back a little bit to get that extra polish. And then, yeah, one reason why you might want to delay is because you want more polish. You know, there's too many bugs. Some features don't feel quite right. They need a little bit more iteration and fine tuning to feel better and to be a more enjoyable experience. So that can be one. And one of the last reasons that I could think of off the top of my head is adding an additional platform for launch. So you might be working on a game and then a new platform comes out. Say the Google Stadia. And you're like, oh, this is a cool opportunity. Google is saying they will give us X amount of money if we port the game to Google Stadia. And then you look at your budget and you look at how much it would take time. You have to estimate because you're making a game for a new platform. And then you say, okay, we will push the launch by X amount of time, and we will also launch on this new platform, say Google Stadia or Switch, and you decide to push back. You might be thinking, why wouldn't they just launch the extra platform later? That can also be done. That is one way to do it. You launch your primary platforms first, and then this extra platform you launch later. However, some companies want to have them all at the same time because then the marketing focus becomes more concentrated. You do one big push close to launch and during launch, instead of having two separate pushes. So you have the main push, and then you have to have an extra push for the additional platform, which splits your marketing budget and efforts. So, some of the reasons. Let's see what you've been talking about there. Akimbo, also, you just straight up can't get through cert if there's too many blockers. Yes, so in cert, or certification, as it is known, the first parties, so Sony, Microsoft, Nintendo, any first party essentially, except on PC, they have specific requirements that you have to meet. You know, if I'm playing on an Xbox, I can't show PlayStation buttons in the UI, for example, or if the controller disconnects, certain things have to happen, or if the player is playing online and they lose their internet connection, certain things have to happen, or if they put their console in suspend mode and then they continue, certain things need to happen. So usually you will send your game to certification for the first parties, and then they will go through the game and they'll give you a list of things that you have to fix and things that they would want you to fix but you can ship without fixing. Usually, what I've seen, you have a 2 submission strategy. So you submit your first candidate to them. You expect it to fail because there will be stuff that you miss always, and then you expect to get the list back from Sony, Microsoft, whatever, and you fix the must fixes at least, and maybe some of the good to fixes, and then you try to go for a second time, and that one you expect to go through, and that is safer than going for just one shot to try to clear it, because if you only have one shot and you miss it, it's going to be very bad. Some situations that don't lead to a delay, the developer is being lazy. That is never the reason for a game being delayed. Like, it's fine to criticize a game, you know, something is not working in the game, something you're not enjoying in the game, that's fine. Calling the developers lazy, I think, is a lazy critique in and of itself. It is very empty without substance. It is a easy handoff to say that the developers are not even trying, which is not the case. Developers work very, very hard on their games. Very hard. Usually people have something else underneath that comment, and I would encourage people to use some other words that are more descriptive than lazy devs, because it's usually not a case of that. Extra time, so developers don't need to crunch. This is, from what I've seen in my part of the industry, delays typically don't happen so that you can make sure that people don't have to crunch. Unfortunately, it's not something I like, but that is typically if you're crunching any delay, usually that crunch is also delayed, which is bad. Although in the indie scene and smaller studios, this can, of course, be a case, and I hope it becomes more common to give developers extra time so that they can finish the game without having to crunch. But also, huge increases in scope typically don't happen. So, say you are in production, and then you decide, like, oh, the game is an MMO now. It was a 2D platformer, but now we're going to make it a 3D MMO. Like, that doesn't happen. That just doesn't happen because that much of a change is not feasible to do. It's just not feasible. Yeah. Then to close things off, like, delays are usually a good thing for a game. Like, if you see a game being delayed, don't be like, grr, but I want it now. Like, I understand that if there's a game you're really looking forward to, that you want it then and there. But if the game is delayed, in the end, that will hopefully, if everything is managed well, make the game a better game. So usually that is a good thing for the player. The main problem, however, is that if there is crunch happening already when the game is delayed, it can lead to a prolonged crunch period, which is bad for the people working on the game. This is the case, for example, on Cyberpunk 2077. When they delayed the game, I think it was either in January or February this year, when they said it's going to get delayed by like 5 months or something. They also openly stated that this means that the crunch period will also get extended by 4 months, which is bad. That's a really bad thing. It's like crunch periods shouldn't last that long. They should be like a couple of weeks at most. At most. So that is kind of the problem with delays from a developer side of things, that it is unfortunately not a way to take pressure off of developers always from that standpoint. Although it can take pressure off by making the game better, where developers feel more confident in their release. But one of the things I'm really happy about regarding delays is that nowadays the reception of delays by players is usually positive. Usually when you see a game being delayed, nowadays people are like, okay, great, they'll have more time to make the game better. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people who also think that now they won't have to crunch, which, like I said, usually is not the case, unfortunately. So that's an unfortunate fact. But I think it is nice that players are more okay with waiting so that they get a better game. I think that's really nice. And that has definitely changed over the last 5-6 years, because like during the 360 PS3 era, it definitely was not met with happiness. My hope is just that for the future, delays would also take into consideration the workers, the developers, so that they don't have to crunch, so that, you know, stuff can be made on a sane schedule that is more humane. I hope that becomes a thing. But unfortunately, that is a thing that we as workers have to fight for. It's not going to be given to us.